Good afternoon. As I mentioned earlier during the symposium, we're going to take you on a journey from understanding where oblates have come from and where they are today. So next, we'll begin to formulate a vision for a new understanding of oblates into the future. Then finally, the last step, we'll begin to formulate some concrete steps for how we move into a new vision and a new future. As we begin, I think it's critical to unpack this present moment. In other words, what are the assumptions that we make about what it means to be an oblate, or even to be a professed Benedictine? What are the assumptions that cenobitic communities make about oblates? And most importantly, what are the actions and attitudes that flow from those assumptions? So as we unpack this, when I give a presentation, I like to start with a text, and usually a text from Scripture, sometimes the rule. But today, as we talk about identity, I'm going to start with a very different text from one of the great classics of English literature, Alice in Wonderland, which is definitely not a children's story. I get the sense that the image of falling down a rabbit hole and ending up in a place where nothing really makes sense is quite apropos for our times on many levels. So if you'll bear with me, I'd like to spend some time on Alice's conversation with the caterpillar. The caterpillar and Alice looked at each other for some time in silence. At last, the caterpillar took the hookah out of its mouth and addressed her in a languid, sleepy voice. "Who are you?" said the caterpillar. This was not an encouraging opening for a conversation. Alice replied rather shyly, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have changed several times since then." "What do you mean by that?" said the caterpillar sternly. "Explain yourself." I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir," said Alice, "because I'm not myself, you see." "I don't see," said the caterpillar. "I'm afraid I can't put it more clearly," Alice replied very politely, "for I can't understand it myself to begin with, and being so many different sizes in a day is very confusing." "It isn't," said the caterpillar. "Well, perhaps you haven't found it so yet," said Alice, "but when you have to turn into a chrysalis, you will someday, you know, and then after that into a butterfly, I should think you'll feel it a little queer, won't you?" "Not a bit," said the caterpillar. "Well, perhaps your feelings may be different," said Alice. "All I know is it would feel very queer to me." "You," said the caterpillar contemptuously. "Who are you?" Does anyone identify with Alice? Having been so many sizes in one day is very confusing. No wonder Alice is confused about who she is. The poor caterpillar is confronted with this strange, confused creature who doesn't know what she is and can't seem to explain herself. No wonder they can't communicate. Well, poor Alice is suffering from an identity crisis. She isn't who she used to be. She seems to be changing several times a day, and she isn't sure who she's going to be in a few minutes. She's confronted with a caterpillar who seems quite sure he knows exactly who he is and who he is going to be, and doesn't seem the least bit concerned about any changes. Anyone starting to see some analogies to Benedictine life today? I suspect that to be a Benedictine oblate today is a little bit like being Alice. If you have been an oblate for more than, say, 5 minutes, you know what it means to see your identity change. When the oblate, quote, program was first initiated in our community in 1988, it came largely from the impetus of the people who would become oblates. The sisters really weren't quite sure who these people were and why they wanted to be affiliated with us. For many years, I think our sisters saw the oblates as these nice people who liked us and they came for retreats. They did dishes for us while they were here. And we thought that was really sweet. I mean, here are all these nice people who want to have a connection with us, the sisters. I think there was an unconscious sense of, "Aw, isn't that cute? These oblates, they really like the monastery and the sisters." I don't get the sense that in the early years of the oblate program in our community at St. Gertrude's, and I suspect in other communities, that there was much thought given to who and what oblates were. Our sisters knew that oblates made some kind of commitment, but we probably weren't exactly sure what that was, much less what it meant. I don't know, but I suspect that most of the oblates looked at professed monastics as the wisdom figures, as the, quote, real Benedictines. My sense is that the relationship tended to be rather passive on the part of oblates and could border on patronizing on the part of the professed monastics. Now, this is a very blunt assessment, hopefully an exaggerated one, but I suspect there's at least a kernel of truth there. So let's fast forward to today. Something is happening, isn't it? Do you feel Benedictine tectonic plate shifting under your feet? Do all of you who are oblates feel a little like Alice? If someone asks you, like the caterpillar, "Who are you?" do you also feel like replying, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have changed several times since then." And do all of you who are professed monastics, do you look at the oblates and identify with the caterpillar when he says, "What do you mean by that?" said the caterpillar sternly. "Explain yourself." I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir, said Alice, because I am not myself, you see. "I don't see," said the caterpillar. I'm going to suggest that Alice's identity crisis also describes the changing self-understanding of oblates and the relationship between oblates and cenobitic monastics. This shift in understanding is largely due to changing realities and perceptions of what it means to be Benedictine. I think 50 years ago, the question, "What does it mean to be Benedictine?" was quite clear. No one was having an identity crisis yet. But today, a consciousness shift, a shift in perspective, is underway, and mostly on the part of oblates. I want to explore that consciousness shift, changing perceptions, by framing it in terms of a couple of stories. One story happened a few months ago. For the last 5 years, I've led a program called Living as a Monk in Everyday Life. It's a 9-month program for people who want to explore Benedictine spirituality outside of traditional religious life. It's basically a course in Benedictine spirituality. At one of the 3 retreats that are part of this program, one of the women who was participating shared that she had a very strong sense that she was being called to pray for vocations to our community, that she was afraid that St. Gertrude's would die out without new vocations soon. She was literally in tears as she shared this. And of course, I thanked her and I said how much we appreciated the prayers, her support, her concern. But I also said, as carefully and as tactfully as I could, that what she was learning in the program was that Benedictine spirituality was also something that she could live as a married woman, that Benedictine life wasn't limited to professed monastics. I said this, and she responded by continuing to cry and to say how much she was going to encourage people to pray for vocations when she went home. The other story, by way of contrast, is a revelation that one of our sisters had a few years ago. This happened shortly after a Sunday morning at our annual oblate retreat, when our new oblates make their oblation. The oblates do so in our chapel at the end of morning praise on Sundays. Maybe 2 or 3 days later, the sister came up to me and said that watching the new oblates had been a major revelation for her. She said, "I realize that the oblates have a vocation too, just like we do. It's different than our vocation as sisters, but it really is a vocation." And she shared that this was the first time, after many years of seeing people make their oblations, that this had occurred to her. So to be overly simplistic, I think these stories represent at least part of the range of thinking about Benedictine identity and vocation. For the woman in the Living as a Monk in Everyday Life program, it didn't matter whether she was learning to apply Benedictine principles in her married life. It was the sisters who had a vocation, who were the, quote, real Benedictines. In her thinking, if there weren't enough professed monastics, there would be no Benedictine life. And then, on the other hand, we heard the story of a woman who entered our community at age 13, made her monastic profession at age 18, who has been professed for over 50 years, and who thought that oblates do also have their own kind of vocation. So in some way, these two attitudes, these two stories, indicate the degree and kind of differences that we are talking about when we discuss Benedictine identity and vocation. I think we are in the middle of the conversation between Alice and the caterpillar, and if we want to know how to respond to the question, who are you, we need to explore this further. I think perhaps we can represent these attitudes in terms of graphics. It's possible to see the term Benedictine vocation as having a very clear, limited definition. In other words, one definition of vocation is that it exists in a clearly defined box with very clear boundaries. This is what vocation is. Period. End of story, according to this view. So this is the traditional Roman Catholic understanding. There is a definition of vocation, clear requirements under canon law. There's very little that's fuzzy about it. Those of us who have made monastic profession have a vocation to religious life under Roman Catholic canon law. And according to this understanding, oblates who have no formal status under canon law are not living, quote, religious life and don't have a separate, quote, vocation. Now, I'm clearly belaboring the point and exaggerating it, so we can start to understand that this is one definition, this is one set of assumptions, and it has been the predominant definition, and a lot of assumptions flow from this view. So, again, to belabor it a little more, this definition, this understanding of Roman Catholic vocations isn't good or bad or right or wrong. It's one perspective, one definition, one understanding. But it's also the perception that is largely what's behind the concern that contemporary Benedictine life is in deep trouble. If this is the definition of vocation, then yes, Benedictine life is undergoing serious challenges. If a Benedictine vocation only means a vocation to traditional religious life, then yes, Benedictine life in North America is in trouble. Women and men continue to enter monastic life, absolutely, but the reality is there simply aren't enough in terms of numbers. The average age of professed monastics continues to climb. Monasteries are starting to close. So yes, we absolutely have to keep praying. We have to keep encouraging healthy people to enter religious life. But we also have to look at how we're thinking. We have to question our assumptions. So the question is, what if, quote, vocation doesn't have to fit in a box? What if it doesn't have to start with a capital V? The word vocation comes from Latin vocare, to call. And of course, Benedict is all about listening to God's delightful voice, listening to God's call. So can we break out of the box and use the depth and power of this word that means to be called to describe oblates? Can this be a new identity, a new sense of commitment for Benedictine oblates? Can she quit asking rhetorical questions? We've seen that the phrase vocation for many people is something that exists within a box with very clearly defined boundaries, like in the graphic in the last slide. And I think we've seen that a narrow definition of Benedictine vocation is also part of what's fueling a perception that Benedictine life is in trouble today. So let's try thinking differently. Unlike this poor cat, we're going to consider new ways of thinking. We will think outside the box. So boxes are actually very useful structures. They help us make sense of the world. They create necessary boundaries. They keep things orderly. As we saw in the cartoon, they prevent terrible messes sometimes. But sometimes boxes are limiting. As we can see, sometimes boxes can be confining, stultifying. They can keep us from considering new possibilities. So what if a vocation doesn't have to fit into a box? What if a vocation can be something completely different from a canonical Roman Catholic vocation? A vocation, a calling, can be organic, flexible, creative, something that is in process, changing, adapting. What if it's not an either-or dichotomy? Either you have a canonical vocation to the religious life in the Catholic Church, or you're part of the monastic fan club. Oblate doesn't have to be somehow in competition with or a threat to professed Benedictine life. The oblate vocation is a different vocation. It's a different call. It's a different way of living Benedictine life. Not better, not worse, just different. Now, for many of you, this is really quite obvious. You're quite ready for me to get on to the substantive stuff. But the implications of saying that oblates have a Benedictine vocation, that oblates are Benedictines, has huge implications for all of us who live according to the rule need to unpack. So we're going to discuss this in a second, but to put it in perspective, let's take a look at what happens if we start thinking differently about Benedictine vocations. If Benedictine oblates continue to understand themselves and professed Benedictines continue to understand oblates as nice people who like the monks or the sisters, and we, the professed Benedictines, give them retreats occasionally, they're glad if they come and help with projects. There's not a whole lot more than that. What will happen? What will happen if we continue our current assumptions and attitudes? Now, I don't mean to be apocalyptic, or, well, maybe I do, but I think in the years ahead we will face the risk that a lot of the professed monastics will have died out waiting by the door for the new, quote, real vocations to come that never showed up. I think in the future, if we don't change our assumptions and attitudes, there will be large numbers of orphan oblates who belong to monasteries that have either ceased to function or who have no time or energy to give to their oblates, and those oblates won't know what to do. They won't have been empowered. They won't have understood themselves as having a vocation. Now, to be clear, this is actually a scenario of great hope, of great possibility. We are being invited into a whole new era of Benedictine life. We are living into the Paschal mystery. It is only by going through death that we ever come to new life. So let's talk about this further. If being an oblate can be a vocation, a calling to be Benedictine, to live according to the rule insofar as your state in life allows, how does the world look different if this is true? How does your life as an oblate look different if being an oblate is a vocation? And for those of us who are professed, who have a more traditional vocation, what does the reality of an oblate vocation mean for our communities? Now, I know you've got this. I can see the little wheels turning. They've been turning for a while. But just to give you a little push, I'll suggest some ideas. The implications for professed Benedictines are that oblates are the future of our communities. We aren't getting enough vocations to continue to support our communities as they have been. So, what does it mean if we partner with people who have a different sort of Benedictine vocation? For oblates, the implications of having a Benedictine vocation are perhaps centered around the idea of responsibility, a stronger commitment, having a vocation and not just being a fan of the monastery means a stronger responsibility to really live the rule of Benedict, to support our various communities, to take leadership of the oblate communities and way of life. So these are just some very initial thoughts, and I'd like you to take 5 minutes at first in quiet by yourself to write down some thoughts about the implications of these ideas. And then we'll spend some considerable time discussing your thoughts at our tables. And then finally, each table will come up and report on the key ideas that you've discussed at your tables. There's paper at your tables along with directions. So again, 5 minutes in quiet by yourself. We'll spend a considerable time discussing at tables, and then each table can summarize the main ideas of your discussion and come forward to report those.